All right. And potentially one of the riskiest things I've ever done. I'm currently recording this slideshow while driving. Uh, it's not advised, but hey, during AP season you gotta grind. It's whatever it takes. All right. So today, uh, we are going to review the scientific revolution, Enlightenment. Um, I'll do my best to try to again point out where I think potential questions could be, all that kind of fun stuff. Um, uh, if I die in making this video, this one's for you guys. All right, so scientific revolution, as far as social things goes, I think they quite frequently, they being College Board, quite frequently like to ask questions about how both the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment are going to affect women. And so one thing to kind of keep in the back of your mind here uh, is that women not only contribute to the movements, both in the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. So, like for example, some examples that I would definitely know with the scientific revolution is Cavendish and Winckelmann. Both make important contributions to the scientific revolution, and yet they are almost completely excluded from the scientific community that develops during the scientific revolution. Okay, and so um, the fact that women were able to make these contributions while still being largely kept out of these scientific communities and schools does show the increased educational opportunities for upper class people, and how like this fact that like upper class families, even with limited opportunities for women, are still going to kind of make efforts to make sure that the females and the women in their family are going to like be exposed to the world. Um, I think that as far as one of the other things that's going to be important here is that literacy is going to increase during this time period too. So when we talk about like uh, the late 1500s and throughout the 1600s, and remember, so the scientific revolution really equate with like basically, I guess I don't know where you would draw the line where it starts. I mean, maybe with Copernicus. So maybe this is like a 200-year thing. But really, most strongly, the effects of the scientific revolution are going to be felt in the 1600s. And so the printing press is going to expand greatly as both a tool or as a way of uh, I mean, so like political entities are going to encourage printing presses. Okay, so there's part of that. So as like states become more solid and states like consolidate their power, these printing presses are going to be a sort of a tool for them to make their societies better and stronger, and their economy stronger, and them richer. Um, but understand that like this is also like in other societies, like the Dutch, for example, like there's as the commercial economy and world trade and all that kind of stuff spreads, um, like new technology spread with it. And so like this is just, I mean, the kind of chicken and egg type thing there too. Um, there's also going to be huge improvements in medical knowledge that are going to really greatly improve the quality of life. Okay, so we're going to start to move towards like science having an actual influence on the average person's life, and maybe that's overstating that. Okay, I kind of take that back. Um, but we're gonna like the beginnings of that, I guess, are gonna start. Okay, so I mean, understanding how the flow of blood works, how your body works better. Those are gonna, at least in areas where they had access to educated people, it's done. It kind of starts to cut out all the craziness and you know um, fanatical witchcraft kind of stuff. Hold on, I gotta make a turn here. Uh, all right, so political. Um, so political realities of the scientific revolution. I think the biggest thing to recognize here is that the scientific revolution is really spurred on and really egged on by this the political societies and royal societies, like these scientific societies that are, and I think like the two that are created by monarchs. And I think monarchs kind of rightly recognize that, like, hey, this brings prestige and honor and noteworthiness to like not only my court but like my country, and it can improve the power of my country, and especially because a lot of these early scientific discoveries also had like practical implications. I mean, we're going to talk about these with the technological side on this. Is like the telescope was originally developed for military purposes, and like Galileo made really important discoveries for ballistics and like how to shoot more accurate bullets and things like that. So, or cannon balls. So like those types of things are um, somewhat practical, I guess, for these kings to not only like want to try to be the cool guy on the street with all like the fancy scientists around him, um, but also like, hey, this actually can like improve my power in a whole multitude of ways. Just and so just be aware of that. If we talk about religion things, remember the biggest change that comes from the scientific revolutions with regards to religious beliefs is that like we start to move, at least educated people start to move away from the believing that like things happen in the world because God wants them to, and more towards like things happen in the world because of like rational, logical, physical realities that can be explained. Um, and I always give you that example. Is like people move away from believing that like God causes like earthquakes and volcanoes to erupt to like understanding, well, like there are geological explanations for why those things happen, and so like even that small change is going to be really important with regards to like uh, the way that people view their world, and how they explain things, and how people view God too. Um, I mean, we've talked about how this eventually leads to deism. I think that obviously you should still see that there's a conflict between science and religion, as evidenced by like the fact that Galileo gets put on house arrest. So this is like the church doesn't just sort of back away from this, um, like sort of holding on to these truths that they had taught for 1,000 years at that point. They don't just sort of back away from that willingly. They, and especially because a lot of this coincides with like counter Reformation attempts to like control information and control like dissidents, and like basically you know controlling what people knew about the world as part of like the indoctrination of this whole thing. Um, all right, let's talk about intellectual stuff. I think one of the things and we talked about this in class, I think we actually spent a whole day talking about this, is that, we use this term science loosely, okay? So, like it's going to kind of change from a mix of magic and religion and pseudoscience, and what I mean by pseudoscience is like, there were some things, um, hold on, there are some things that are, like they're understanding that like plants and things that like herbs and different things do have like beneficial effects, even though I don't really understand like why. Okay, so that's what by pseudoscience would kind of mean. Um, and so like when we say that like science is going to spread in the scientific revolution, one, it's going to be very slow. Okay, so I always remember that. And then the second thing is like understand like the spread of this like scientific way of thinking and this way about the world would have been only like concentrated in this upper echelon of intellectuals and people in royal courts and universities, and so like most like even in the 1600s, most of and I would maybe argue into the 1700s, and I think in the 1700s you kind of see the average person mostly move away from this to some extent. But throughout the 1600s, the average Joe is going to totally believe in magic and witches and like the crazy stuff that like the Monty Python, like she's a witch and she turned people into newts and they got better and like all that kind of crazy stuff. Okay, so like that's one of the things to remember with when we talk about the scientific revolution, and still with Enlightenment. But this is one important difference. By the time that we get to like the late 1700s with the end of the Enlightenment, the literacy rates are way, way, way higher, and so the ability of the Enlightenment ideas to sort of filter through society is way easier. Also, you got to think about is like I mean, when enlightened people are talking, enlightened philosophers are talking about is like, hey, maybe we shouldn't like torture people and execute people differently for different crimes, and maybe we should have capitalism than in the free free markets, and like people should have rights. So maybe, and to some extent, like enlightenment thought is easier to grasp. I mean, like some peasant in 1650s France is not going to understand. Well, calculus was made in the 1690s. That's a bad example. Okay, so like, well, even so, like 1690s France, like some peasant's not going to be able to comprehend calculus, even if they were literate. So like, I think like that's like the differences in complexity of the discoveries, I think, is also noteworthy. I think you should also understand that the Reformation does play a role in this. I mean, I think like the whole like questioning of the church is opened up by the Reformation to start with. Um, and I think it's, remember, we've talked about this a couple times. Is like, I think it's interesting too that like Copernicus is essentially the one who kind of opens up this whole scientific revolution. Was a member of the church, and so kind of keep that in the back of your mind, that there's a relationship between like church and new knowledge and questioning the church and the Reformation. So these things are kind of overlapping with each other. We do see major advancements in medicine as far as intellectual go. Okay, so we're going to move away from Galen's theories, which he was the Greco-Roman, I forget which one, theorist about how the body worked, and like that was like there's like 4 essences that control your body, all that kind of fun stuff. And then so Vesalius and Harvey are the 2 people that I always tell you to remember as far as like accomplishments of the scientific revolution. Remember those 2 names. Remember those 2 names. All right, scientific method. Remember, use this term lightly, okay? So even though they're like kind of coming up with what will later become the scientific method, they're not actually framing it as such. I mean, Bacon will write a lot about like how the best way to form knowledge is like test, retest, like control variables, hypothesize, all that, how those things kind of fit together. But he's not actually going to call it the scientific method, nor is like what Descartes is doing. Like similarly, they're kind of like both kind of piecing together what scientists will later kind of mold together into what we now learn as the scientific method. And hey, remember, the other thing that Descartes does, don't forget about Cartesian duality. Okay, don't forget about Cartesian duality. The splitting of the physical self with the spiritual soul, and it allowed scientists to more freely and without guilt dissect human bodies and sort of explore the physical realm without kind of having any kind of religious implications for that. And then Newton, obviously, I mean, I don't need to say Newton, right? So gravity, laws of motion, physics and calculus, all that kind of fun stuff, okay? And remember, Newton's biggest thing is like, and all those specific discoveries are obviously very important, but like the main thing that comes from Newton is the fact that like, hey, like everything can be explained. There is natural laws that govern the way that the physical world works. All we got to do is figure them out, okay? And that's essentially the story of the Enlightenment. It's like, hey, let's figure out all these natural laws that control everything. All right? Take a quick pause here. Think about these questions real quick, okay? Because this is a nice little way to kind of review, so you're not just listening and blindly thinking, especially you guys that know that you're on the verge of not passing, really needing a little bit of extra grind, okay? Remember, whatever it takes. All right. Scientific revolution, technologically speaking, okay, there's going to be many new inventions. You could name drop any of these in an SAQ, LAQ, DBQ, telescope, microscope, pendulum clocks, so the better timekeeping, barometers, thermometers, mechanical calculators, mathematical symbols. I mean, even like that's crazy to me that took so long to develop. But like these, like, are going to not only have an effect on like scientific discovery, like I said, but they have like wide-reaching effects. I think it's kind of crazy actually that like the first clocks were not even made until like 1400s or something like that. Like that's crazy to me. But there's many technological advances. Galileo being a big part of this, obviously. All right, let's move on to Enlightenment. Okay. If you really want to mash an Enlightenment video, I have like an hour-long Enlightenment video. Look it up. So it's amazing. I'm going to try to give you the shorthand version right now. Okay, so Enlightenment. Always remember, Enlightenment, 1700s intellectual movement. Okay, Enlightenment is going to try to apply the rules of this sort of natural law philosophy about the way the world works to anything that they can kind of do. All right, so they have a faith in reason and faith in revelation. So like they're going to figure things out. They're going to be led by this sort of group of philosophers who sort of create this community of letters. So they write back and forth. They publish things using the printing press. But let's get to some of these intellectuals. Oh, hey, so one of the things I didn't mention about so when we talk about the bridge between the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, don't forget that like you essentially need to like. So Newton is probably the most important, but Locke is definitely a sort of close second in that, because Locke's tabula rasa and Locke's sort of conception as humans as blank slates is really, really important. We've talked about that a whole bunch of times. Like, if you believe that humans are essentially a product of everything that gets input to them, of all of their experiences, then like that's like the greatest, like, I guess, like, I mean, there's no better way to, like, if you start to really believe that, like, you definitely want to educate people as much as you possibly can. You want to make sure that, you know, like, we're giving people opportunities to input as much knowledge as they can so we can keep building what humans know. It's also like a huge statement about like faith and progress, that like, hey, like we essentially are infinitely capable as long as we just continue to expand our knowledge. All right. So when we start talking about this, just kind of keep that in mind. The bridge between the scientific revolution is essentially Locke and Newton. All right. When we talk about Enlightenment intellectualism, Hobbes is going to believe in a monarchy, not divine right, though. Okay, so like he doesn't believe that like the monarch's power comes from God. He believes that the monarch's power comes from a social contract, and that like essentially a government is put in place to protect human rights. And remember, we said that's the biggest thing with Hobbes. He like believed that people had rights. And that's in the 1640s. That's 40 years before the English Bill of Rights is signed. And so, like, what Hobbes is going to say is that, like, people have rights. You need to trade these, like, humans trade these other rights in order for, like, the government to protect their most sacred right of life and maintain security. Now, Hobbes is going to differ in a couple ways. So they're, like, Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau are all going to be social contract theorists. But Hobbes is going to want a monarchy, which is different than the other two. And then Hobbes also has a really negative view of humans. I mean, the reason he says that like you need a strong government to protect people's security is because he believed that people were naturally bad, and that if people are just left to their own accord, like life is going to be nasty, brutish, and short, and you know, like people are just going to go around wildly killing people, and he calls this the state of nature and how it's like chaotic and violent and all the bad things. Locke is going to be different. So again, he's going to use the social contract theory, but he says like, well, like the social contract theory doesn't work in the sense that like people make this contract with their ruler and trade their rights away, as that like the government is created by, I shouldn't say it that way. The government, a government that respects the way that God grants human rights is that like governments are meant to protect all of the rights that God gives to people. I didn't say that well, but and so like Locke says that people are naturally good and that they're corrupted by society, and that's why you need government in order to kind of like call in people's greed, I guess, and that greed is established because of society and materialism and that kind of stuff. So Locke has differences with Hobbes about like the type of government that he would advocate for, and like he has different views about people. I'm going to skip Montesquieu, I'll come back to him. Rousseau is like the third social contract theory. He's going to argue for direct democracy. He's going to believe humans are good. We'll talk about Rousseau being like the first the first romantic. And we actually talked about that in class a couple days ago, is that like, you know, Rousseau is going to write Emile. So if I don't make sure that I talk about Emile somewhere in here. All right, I'm reminding myself right now. Montesquieu is the whole checks and balances thing. So remember, he comes up with like, hey, the best way for a government to maintain people's rights is to not allow government to become too strong, and the best way that you do that is you create a bunch of branches of government that all like lap over each other, the whole checks and balances thing. Um, there's going to be opposition to death penalty. Remember, the guy that to sort of associate that most strongly with is the Beccaria guy. Um, and then obviously the last, and this is maybe the biggest accomplishment of the Enlightenment in like a tangible thing, is that like they put together the like the first encyclopedias. All right. I think you can see that like the church is still very much sort of against the spread of new knowledge and information and open-mindedness because they put the encyclopedia on the index of prohibited books. All right, Enlightenment social. Okay, so there's going to be huge reforms in education. This stems a lot from Locke's Tabula Rasa. Many political leaders start to find this very convincing. We see the first sort of compulsory education systems being put in place. So I think the first one was in 1717 or something like that. It's in Prussia, I know that. But like education is the key to human progress. We got to start educating people. That's the only way to make society better. The other thing, okay, here's Rousseau's Emile. The other thing is, and this doesn't happen until the way end of the 1700s, and this is why I think to some extent Rousseau is going to foreshadow this romantic change, is that Rousseau's going to talk about that like kids are not small adults. They need to be treated differently. They have emotions and feelings, and that like humans aren't robots. Like humans are emotional, creative, free-thinking things that like it's not just like plug and play. Like here's a whole bunch of knowledge. We're just going to stick it in your brain and then we go. Okay. So like the emphasis of like emotions and feelings is like essentially part of the Romantic movement that's going to spring up after Napoleon. The Napoleonic Wars in the 1800s. You're going to see literacy spread, obviously, and then you're going to see literacy continue to spread even in the middle classes because as education spreads, you're going to talk about how, like, or we're going to talk about how, like, you know, literacy is really going to be tied to reading the Bible, and so, like, one of the things that is really an important piece of this, and maybe France is the counterexample, because remember, France is still very Catholic, but like the French culture is different than most other Catholic countries. But most of the highest literacy rates are going to be in Protestant countries because Protestants emphasize individual readings of the Bible. So that's going to be important. Women are going to play a role in the Enlightenment, most notably through the salon movements. So remember we talked about what's Madame Joffrin. So Madame Joffrin is the one who ran the most influential salon in Paris, but the women are going to play a different role in the Enlightenment in a whole bunch of different ways. Okay, so the two biggest ones that I would remember are Emily de Châtelet, which we talked about the other day in class. She's the one that interprets and transcribes all of Newton's works into French. Okay, she basically creates like a physics and calculus book in French language that is really important to helping spread Newton's ideas. And then Mary Wollstonecraft is the one who writes The Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And like essentially her argument is that like, hey, this Enlightenment is based on like everyone being equal and free. Well, like, you know, that includes women too, right? So like that's the whole, like she kind of opens up this whole like equality means equality and God-given rights mean God-given rights to all humans, not just like men and women didn't have different God-given rights. All right, I'm gonna try to quickly go through this. Okay, so we are getting into more dangerous territory. All right, so political, constitutionalism. Okay, you should be able to compare and contrast Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. We're gonna talk more about the enlightened absolutists. Okay, so that's on the next lecture, so I'm not gonna go into that a bunch. Obviously, be able to connect Enlightenment political thought to the growth of constitutionalism, the growth of like the Napoleonic Code and laws and like codes of laws. That's important. All right, economic or Enlightenment religious thought. So they're going to believe that deism is essentially like the way to explain how the world works and how religion works and how God works. And remember, this whole like God is a cosmic clockmaker thing. Like God is a you know, like he kind of sets everything in motion. He sets all the rules of how the things are going to be governed, but then he kind of just lets it go. Okay, And one of the things that you need to understand is that in believing this, they're also going to believe that, like, hey, like superstition and like magic and mystical things don't exist in the world. And so, like, one a good example of this is Thomas Jefferson writes a Bible, um, and his version of Jesus' story is like all Jesus' teachings, but none of like the miracle stuff. So there's no superstition, no like having to believe that, um, you know, like humans can raise people from the dead and they can turn water to wine, all that kind of stuff. All right, so let's talk about Voltaire. Okay, so he's going to challenge traditional Catholic doctrine. Um, he's going to write Candide, which is like the basic. He's basically going to just make fun of everybody um, as he kind of goes through this. Um, I'm going to stop here, okay? Because this, I'm going to stop. I'm gonna come back to this. All right, back in the grind. I'm out now in a stable position. I don't have to worry about killing myself and making an AP video. All right, where did I leave off? So, Voltaire. Yeah, I think this is where I left. Okay, so Voltaire, like everybody teaches Voltaire so much, I'm not even sure like you would get questions about him. If you do get questions about Voltaire, I mean, the biggest thing with him is that he's going to be very, very, very critical of the Catholic Church as an institution, all right? And he's going to, I guess, and to some extent, like, just challenge the like fanaticism and superstition that he believed that the church, as an institution, had um, sort of like encouraged to some extent. I guess in his view, because he wanted people to have religious toleration. Um, he wanted people to be open. He wanted people to be questioning. And he's thought like anytime that you were certain about something that
Grind for that 5, guys!
Woo!
You got it!
Yeah!
Woo!
all right, cool. All right, see you guys. All right, roll tide, we're back. This isn't the most bizarre YouTube lecture that I've ever made. I'm encouraged for whatever beats that. So getting back to this is Voltaire's political views are going to be very similar to Hobbes. He's like we talked about this in class, if you remember. He's going to argue strongly for like enlightened absolutism and monarchical rule because he felt that like royal governance was well-educated governance, and that as long as it was practiced in sort of an enlightened way, then like essentially that was the best way to make sure that the government was moving society and the state in the right direction and looking out for most people. So basically, you just didn't want dumb people in government, and that's the whole like Kant. That's like the whole thing with Kant is like we live in an age of enlightenment, not an enlightened age, and like how like that awareness of like how dumb the average person still was at that time, like really affects and like you know if it just basically that's like the point at which like they deviate from typical enlightened thinkers. We look at economics. Okay, so I think the 1700s is really important because we really shift from like mercantilist dominated economics to a like economic systems that are going to become more and more capitalistic. And I think like the biggest thing that you got to realize here is that, well, one, this has to do with like changing governments, but it also has to do with like changing economies. Okay, so like as this like commercialism starts to grow and more people become part of the economy and in both in an everyday sense and in a broad sense, like commercially speaking, you need to understand is like that change is maybe one of the most underrated changes in like European history and like I would say world history, is that like essentially the bedrock of modern like economics and modern society is the switch between like basically government controlled and manipulated. Well, and I guess maybe I don't know. I may have not sure I'm going to jump off that bridge. I mean, because like I'm still kind of skeptical of this in today's age. But you move from like basically government being in control of the economy, and I would say the government still is in control of the economy to some extent, but like everyday consumerism and consumption of goods and commercialism has way more to do with it than like the sort of overarching. So it's like essentially like the economy becomes run by the masses, and like that doesn't fully develop until the 1800s with like the real takeoff of the Industrial Revolution um, in the mid 1800s, I would say. But just kind of understand is like the bedrock for that is all kind of laid in the 1700s. Like the change starts happening, and so like people that you need to know. Um, so well, they used to ask this question quite a bit as an essay question, is actually like compare and contrast mercantilist policies to like Colbert's policies in France to like what Adam Smith is going to write about in The Wealth of Nations. Um, and essentially, like Colbert is going to be all about like economic protectionism and self-sufficiency. So he wants the government to control things. He wants the government to give monopolies. He wants the government to create tariffs on foreign goods to encourage like production within the state and consumption within the state. There's bullionism at play, like acquire as much precious metals as you possibly can. Whereas like Adam Smith is going to say like, hey, let's break down all barriers to trade, and then like trade is always good for all people. And that like the government does have a role in that. So like the government has like needs to make sure that the society is safe. They need to make sure there's something to protect trade. So basically like kill pirates and build infrastructure, and then like create a stable society. And so like Adam Smith is going to have some sort of government intervention in order to like help promote economic activity, but then essentially like once the economy starts going, just let it go. Like let the invisible hand that he talks about a lot like take care of itself. Like people will buy what they want and what's affordable, and they won't buy what they don't want or what's not affordable, and then like businesses will react to that. So like business will start like making like products that people want more because they can make more money off of it. And so like there's this sort of like harmonious relationship between those two things. During the 1700s, we're also going to see a great increase in like banking technology and the ability to reliably like put money into banks and to track that. See the growth of the triangular trade between Africa, America, and Europe. A lot of this has to do with the slave trade. And I mean, you can really talk about also in the 1700s how the Dutch kind of lose their stranglehold on world trade, and the British kind of take their place. So, I mean, that would actually be an interesting question too, is to like compare and contrast like the Dutch and British models, because the British are like a hybrid of everybody. So they colonize and they control trade all at the same time. Whereas like we had the Spanish who colonized and didn't necessarily control trade routes as much, and then you have the Dutch who controlled trade routes but didn't colonize as much. So that's something interesting to think about. Now, these have all been like topics of essay questions in the past, so just be aware of that. Okay, we got 2 slides left. Let's roll through this. Oh, and this link right here is the link to the long Enlightenment video. I think it's like 50 minutes. Actually, no, I don't know. It's maybe longer than that. I don't know. Who knows? Roll Tide. All right, so let's talk about sort of social changes in like European life in general. Okay, so from the 1600s, remember we talked about during the 1600s that there's a very low amount of population growth, and that is largely because of like the mass amounts of war. They talk a little bit about maybe climate change, but during the 1700s, there's like this massive population boom. Okay, and this is going to be caused by the agricultural revolution, which is spurred by the Columbian Exchange and like new, better products coming, new livestock or new and better ways to have healthier livestock. There's better food transportation because there's better roads, and like governments are getting stronger, so they're building more bridges and no, well, not canals yet. Well, to some extent, yes. And so, like you see the disappearance of the plague in the 1700s. You also are going to start to see some people talk about like sanitation and cleanliness as being a part of being healthy. Um, you're also going to see huge changes to like society in the sense that like we're going to have proto-industrialization or like the cottage industries develop. So like as this agricultural revolution takes hold, which is on the next slide, but like we'll talk about the enclosure acts and um, like the effects of that and like the cottage industries putting out system, whatever you want to call it. And so like this is going to lead to the centralization of factories. Um, that doesn't really take off until very late 1700s, early 1800s. Um, so kind of again, kind of temper the extent. Like the Industrial Revolution starts in the 1700s, especially the late 1700s. Um, but it really doesn't take off until the 1800s, even like the mid 1800s. And the biggest thing, remember, is Bessemer process. Okay, um, we're gonna see people marry in their late 20s. Some areas, especially in Germany, still required you to be like get legal permission to marry if you weren't a noble. Um, and about a half of the people never married at all. So that kind of tells you about how society was changing at those times. You're going to see that like rates of birth outside of wedlock was pretty low. If pregnancy did occur, couples almost always got married. However, when they went to give birth, infant mortality was very, very high. Roughly about half the kids that were born were survived. So like, I remember us talking about this was like, it's really hard for parents to be emotionally invested and attached to their kids like you need to be to raise a baby. Um, if you have like the strong inkling that like, look, this baby's only got a 50% chance of making it. The more invest in it, the more this is going to hurt if the baby does die. So like, I think it leads to like weird family dynamics, especially in like rich people's families where they had enough money where they could have like wet nurses, and essentially like the baby would be raised by someone other than its mom. Uh, okay, so I guess I don't really know what else to say from that. We are going to see in the 1700s that the life expectancy is going to grow. Well, I mean, so 10 years, like growing life expectancy by 10 years is a ton. I mean, like right now, I think the average life expectancy is 78. So like if it went from 78 to 88, if that was like the average person was basically living to 90, that's a huge deal, okay? So and that's essentially what happens here is we go from like 25 to 35. And that has in part to do with better improvements in sanitation. The first smallpox vaccine was created in 1700s. There's better, cheaper clothing and housing and food and all that stuff is going to be important, okay? So like generally speaking, life in the 1700s gets a lot better for most people. Okay? Now, remember this though. This is because urbanization and industrialization really haven't taken off yet. This is kind of like the paradox of the Industrial Revolution. Is I would strongly argue that like 1700s life gets better. This period between like 1800 and 1850, I think you could make a lot of arguments that like with the concentration of populations in urban centers, with the pollution that comes from industrialization, and all the problems that come with like the cramping of and mashing of people into cities, that like we maybe do this like 50-year blip where like things maybe get worse and then they get better. I don't know. All right, agricultural revolution. Okay, so this is hugely important, and I'm told you this many times. I'm still waiting for the agricultural revolution DBQ. Okay, whether that's like I think like a good like the way that the AP is asking these DBQ questions now, like you could legitimately ask the question like, was the agricultural revolution a part of the industrial revolution or not? And like I think the good answer is like yes and no. It is to some extent, and I think it like is essentially like was the cause of the industrial revolution, and I think there's some overlap there, but I think it's its own thing. I mean, and I think like you could talk about ties to the scientific revolution. You could ties to like the commercial revolution that sort of predates this, and like I think there are strong connections, no doubt. But when you look at this, it's like essentially the agricultural revolution acts as like the precursor to industrialization. It's like You have enclosure acts, which change up the way that people raised livestock and grew food. So they have to find other ways to make a living. So then they start utilizing these cottage industries, and or they start moving to urban centers. Um, and so like that's all there. Um, and that okay. So I need to take a step back. I jumped too far ahead. I think the other thing that you should be aware of is like remember that the agricultural revolution starts in the Netherlands because the Netherlands was the place at which you had the fewest amount of farmers that were farming for a chunk of a population. Now, and there still were a lot of farmers, but they were farming for a chunk of the population that had nothing to do with agriculture. So like all these like people that lived in Amsterdam and Delft and like these different Dutch towns that were like basically just commercial centers, these people didn't grow crops, and so they relied on farmers to grow more than they needed to in a way that would allow them to buy food cheaply. And I mean that's the key. Like, look, if you can't, like, you need food to survive. So like, and you may be able to make more money in other economic activities, but like if all the extra money you're making basically is like pays for all of the food that you have because food is too expensive, then you're never gonna do that, right? So that's dumb. Like why? Like so, like understand like this is like the agricultural revolution is kind of complex and like its causes and like its connections to the Dutch, to the scientific revolution, then how it spreads to England and the effects that it has there. Um, I mean, all that's relevant here. Okay, so like I mean, you could bring in tons of evidence here, like all these different um, agricultural products, like Tull's seed drill. Tull's also the first one that invents the plow that is can be pulled behind a horse. Um, and so like there's this important, England, you know, the crop yields in England triple. And I also think like there's interesting stuff, and I think this. I wish I would have wrote that down in this. I think half the people become farmer. Like so, there's like a 50% decrease in the amount of people that are farming in England during the agricultural revolution, and it crop yields triple during that same time. So there's roughly half the people are farming and they're producing 3 times as much goods. So it kind of puts it in perspective how much these like manure, crop rotations, um, like all those things matter here. Okay, and I mean even like remember like where this originates from and like trying to like better create better crops and plants is like the tulip mania, right? So they learned how to like make different colored tulips by doing like genetic, what do they call those, like Mendel's squares or whatever. So kind of understand that. All right, that's all I got today, folks. Didn't die. Roll Tide.